Okay, let's look at the main theorists and approaches to equivalence now. So we start off with Eugene Nida, who, as I mentioned at the beginning, is probably the key name in regards to equivalence theory. And he's an American Bible translator, was working particularly in the 1940s, and he tried to incorporate the work that he'd done in this area of linguistics into Bible translation, and that's why he borrowed from various linguistic paradigms such as semantics, pragmatics, and particularly Noam Chomsky's work on syntactic structure in order to try and describe what he was doing when he was translating the Bible. So we're going to look briefly at Chomsky's influence here, not because I want you to become experts on Chomsky, but because I want you to understand how Nida derived his theory of equivalence from Chomsky's influence, and also how it relates to an understanding of translation process. So remember, process means how you actually translate from A to B. So Chomsky had what's called a generative transformational model. He analysed sentences and looked at the levels of the sentence and came up with rules based on those levels. What's important for translation and for eventually for Nida and for your understanding is to see how the phrase-related rules generated what he called deep structure, which is then transformed to produce surface structure. He also identified what he called kernel sentences as those needing the least transformation. So these are generally simple, active, declarative sentences. Translation is therefore a recoding or change of surface structure in the representation of this non-linguistic deep structure which underlies it. And the next slide will help clarify some of these concepts a little further. So each sentence in a language has two levels of representation. It has a deep structure and a surface structure. So what is the deep structure? This is basically saying what is the sentence saying? So it's the core semantic relations of the sentence. What is it saying? That's basically all you need to know. What's in the red there? What is the sentence saying? It is then mapped onto a surface structure. So this becomes how it is saying it. So if you like, the deep structure is the meaning and the surface structure is the actual words we put together that form the way that we communicate that meaning. Let's look at an example here. We have Pat loves Chris and Chris is loved by Pat. So we have two sentences both roughly meaning the same thing and they use similar words. Pat loves Chris is of course an active sentence and Chris is loved by Pat is a passive sentence. But both of these sentences mean the same thing. So Chomsky would therefore posit that these two sentences are distinct surface forms, so they're saying the same thing in slightly different ways, but they derive from a common deep structure. So the meaning is the same. So the kernel sentence is usually a declarative sentence with only one verb, and the point here is that these are quite easy to translate. You generally don't have too many problems translating kernel sentences. They're basically unmarked in mood, so they're indicative. They're unmarked in voice, so they're usually active rather than passive. And they're often usually positive sentences as well. So for an example, I've given you the man opened the door. So again, Pat loves Chris would be an example of one of these kernel sentences. So what's so important about these kernel sentences for translation? As I said, they're easiest to translate. They're also providing the most basic structures. And language then builds on these to create more elaborate structures. So for translation, we can obtain the kernel, so we can kind of work backwards from the source text surface structure by back transformation. And there's some examples on page 63 to 4 of Monday. So if you think about it, for those of you doing interpreting, you may have been told about deverbalization, for example, which is a really helpful technique of finding out what is actually being said. So if you're presented with a really difficult sentence to translate in your B language, this theory is basically saying, can you strip that back to the most basic structure of language in order to find out what it's saying? And the transformation then occurs when you elaborate on that structure by, using perhaps different adjectives or verb forms or syntactic forms. So the science of translation via NIDA basically came about by using this Chomskyan model to analyse the surface structure of the source text into the deep structure. So basically what I've just described. So NIDA believed that it gave the translator a technique that he or she could use to decode the source text, find out what the source text is saying, and then a procedure or a process or a way of encoding the target text, and then embellishing that message in a way that would enable it to communicate effectively in the target text. So the surface structure of the source text is analysed into the basic elements of the deep structure, and these are then transferred. So remember when we talked about translation as metaphor right back in the introductory lecture, and transferal was one of those metaphorical terms we used. This is what NIDA is doing as well. So he's using transferal to describe translation. So we're basically transferring from A to B, restructuring semantically and stylistically into then what becomes the surface structure of the target text. So it's actually quite a useful technique to use, particularly in these early stages of your learning about translation, in order to make sure you're getting that meaning across and then being able to transfer that meaning into a way that effectively communicates in the target text. So he calls this a three-stage system of translation: analysis, transfer and restructuring, or literal transfer, minimal transfer and literary transfer. In other words, what is the source text saying? What's the meaning? How is it saying it? What are the grammatical structures? And how can we restructure this information in the target text so that it sounds fluent and readable? This is the diagram that NIDA uses to describe this very process. So if we have a look at it again, we can see that A is our source text. We then analyse that source text. We look at it, we decipher it, we try to understand the various deep structures, surface structures of this text. That happens in the analysis. Then we transfer that basic meaning, and then in the final step we restructure, we make it sound good in the target text.